Hey friends, today I'm here to bring you another really fun tutorial on how to add a pop of color or a little bit of extra texture, excitement to one of your more simple garments. This is going to be really perfect, especially for those of you who love the quilted look, who love knee patches, elbow patches, sort of patchwork on clothing. And so without further ado, the tutorial that I'm bringing you today is going to be how to make quilty patchwork on your garments. And if we haven't met yet, hi, hello, I'm Leah, and I have an artisanal, eco-friendly linen clothing business called Darwin Textiles, and it's all dyed using pigments from plants. So the example I'm going to show you today is how I do the patchwork quilty knees on my swallowtail pants. Now these pants are one of the all-time bestsellers in the Charlie Darwin ecosystem, and I'm actually super excited. I am creating right now, I'm digitizing the sewing pattern for it. So you can already buy these pants on my website made to your custom measurements, but I'm actually digitizing my sewing pattern so that all of you sewists out there can sew these pants yourself. Do sign up for my email newsletter below so that you can be the first updated when that tutorial and pattern comes out. But today I'm going to show you just how to do something like the quilty knee patches on that. If patchwork or quilting has seemed a little intimidating to you in the past, this method is going to make it so easy and way more fun to piece your fabrics together and get really satisfyingly crisp seam lines. The secret is actually in using fusible interfacing. In this video, I'm going to share a few simple but clever tricks that are going to help you really master this method on your next sewing project. You could do this technique and apply it to all sorts of different garments. So you might consider doing this as elbow patches or as patch pockets. I could see it being cool as like the bottom few inches on the hem of a pant. Those are just a couple ideas of where you could put it. I think you might have a little bit more resistance adding this style of patchwork to places that usually want to avoid bulk. So things like collars or places with darts or pleats. I think this might just add a little bit too much bulk for what you're looking for. But don't let me hold you back. If you want to experiment, by all means, prove me wrong. It might look awesome in any of those places. So these are the knee patches that we'll be creating today. And again, you can use any fabric that you'd like, but for me, for my project, I'm going to be using a woven fabric, non-stretch. Specifically, I'm using linen, and I have a couple pieces of Osnaburg cotton in here. All of it has been plant dyed, and if you're looking for plant dyed linen, I sell it by the yard and also in scrap bundles, which is perfect for this project. So check out charliedarwintextiles.com, look in my fabric section, see what I've got around right now. If you're looking for really tranquil, earthy colors, earth tones that are super rich. Some other supplies you'll need are fusible interfacing. I typically use a fusible that is very, very lightweight for this project. So I think I use like a Pellon brand featherweight. You'll also want to grab a pair of scissors or a rotary cutter. And I'm using just like a 12 by 12 inch cutting mat for this project so I can cut out my straight squares, and a ruler. But really anything can work. Even just a piece of paper that's the size that you want your squares to be can work just as well. You of course also need a sewing machine, and you will also want an iron that has lots and lots of steam. If you got all of your fabric and your supplies around, then we'll go ahead and jump right into the tutorial. All right, so if you're using the swallowtail pants sewing pattern, I have already pre-calculated all of the measurements for you and your pant size so that you can just sit back and relax on the math and just enjoy the process of sewing. But if you're doing this DIY on a different garment, you can also calculate the size that you need to cut everything just by doing a quick sketch and simple math. So I'll quickly explain here. First, what size do we want to cut our squares? So we're going to say 2.5 inches is what our final square should be. But you could really choose any size here. Now, I recommend that you use a 1/4 inch seam allowance on all 4 edges. So that means that your final square will be 3 inches wide by 3 inches tall. Now, what size do we want to cut our fusible interfacing? Well, you also have to cut the fusible interfacing larger than the garment space that you're trying to fill, because it's also going to get sucked into that seam allowance of each square too. So of course you could guesstimate and cut out your fabric from it, but if you just want to do a quick calculation to make sure you have enough, you can calculate how many squares at their final size will fit into your pattern piece. So if this pink rectangle right here is the final size that I need my patchwork to cover, in my case for knee patches, then I just calculate how many 2.5 inch squares can I fit onto that pattern piece. And it turns out that in this example, I can fit 7 squares by 4 squares going this way. Now all I need to do is just look at how much seam allowance I'm going to have between each of those squares. So right here, 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 here. And so at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, each of these is going to suck in about a 1/2 inch of fabric. And then we got our 2/4 inches on the edge. This is going to add about 3.5 inches to my total dimensions. Then on this side, this is going to add 2 inches to my final dimensions. So I just want to make sure that if this is X and this is Y, that I cut out my fusible interfacing at, in this exact example, X plus 3.5 inches and Y plus 2 inches to account for that seam allowance. And of course, my final square that I'm going to cut is 3 inches to include all that seam allowance as well. All right, now that we know that we want about a 3-inch square for this particular quilty patch that we're going to do, we can start picking out what fabric scraps we want to use. So I've collected a few different colors that I'm considering using. I've got my indigo, light gray, dark gray. I think I'm going to go with a more cool toned palette. And then I kind of like adding this tea brown because I think it adds a little bit of like a sandiness, and it's starting to remind me a little bit of a more beachy type of seam. And now I just need to iron out all of the fabric pieces that I think I'm going to use because I want to get really, really straight edges for this. I'm going to be using my rotary cutter, a ruler, and a cutting mat with a grid on it. For each piece, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try and make sure that the grain line of my fabric is going as nice and horizontal and vertical on the square as possible. So making sure that I don't have it diagonal where we're going to get a weird stretch in either direction on the bias. We want to make sure that the grain line is going to be parallel with the edges of our square. And I know that I want to cut my squares at about 3 inches by 3 inches. So we have our first square, and I'm going to go ahead and repeat that for all of my other squares. All right, I needed 36 squares for my project, and I have all 36 cut out. So now I'm going to cut out my fusible interfacing that's going to get them all in line in one grid. For the swallowtail pants pattern, I actually already have the fusible interfacing knee patch piece sized out for you, so it doesn't need to be measured. So I'm just going to trace around my pattern piece on my fusible, and I'm going to grab 2 of these, 1 for each knee. Now for what I think is the super fun part, I'm going to take all of my squares and I'm going to decide where I want to put them. I think I'm going to stick with doing just 1 knee at a time, and after I do the first knee patch, I'm going to try and get something similar but a little bit different on the other side to add a little bit of balance. What I do to make sure I'm square is I start at one corner of my fusible interfacing and work my way out from there. So I'm just going to play around with where I want my colors to be. I just rearranged them into sort of a gradient from dark to light. If I do something like a gradient, then I just want to make sure that I'm mirroring it since I'm doing knee patches. So I'm going to go ahead and mirror what I have down here up on my top knee patch. So once you're happy with your grid layout, what you want to do next is just make sure that everything is nice and squared up. So I'm just going to lightly sort of tinker around each piece, make sure nothing is super wonky or overlapping with each other. We don't want any overlaps. If anything, a slight space is better than an overlap. And we just want to make sure that these edges are in a relatively straight line. It doesn't need to be perfect, but pretty close to a straight line going horizontal and vertical. Now I'm just going to make sure that my iron is full of water so we can get a really steamy press onto my fusible interfacing. Depending on what type of fabric you have, you might consider using some sort of lightweight, thin pressing cloth if it can't withstand hot temps from your iron. But with linen, I pretty much just go straight onto it and use tons of steam. And just make sure that before you do this, that you've double checked that your fusible interfacing down below has the more bumpy side with the glue on it facing up towards your fabric. I would hate for anyone to press their fusible interfacing down into their ironing board on accident. And according to the instructions on my fusible interfacing, I just hold it, press my steam a couple times, and I usually hold it for about 5 to 10 seconds in each spot. I find it so satisfying to see just how flat it gets once you've fused it. It's just so crisp and I love it. Now I'm just going to repeat for my second quilty patch. So what we're going to do is we're going to just, because we have all of these squares in one line, we can just fold them all down. I find that even if your squares aren't perfectly aligned in a perfect line right here, it generally finds a straight line to crease on. So I'm going to do these long edges first. I'm just going to take row 1 and fold it down right sides facing with row 2. Now what I'm going to do is I don't need real bulky seam allowance here, and my squares are really close to each other. So I'm going to do just a 1/4 inch seam allowance down this straight line. I find I don't tend to need to pin it because it's pretty structured at this point and it doesn't usually slip around anywhere. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'll be back. Now I'm just going to go ahead and repeat this stitching on the next column. So I'm going to go ahead and fold right sides facing this column down and get that natural crease that forms in between my rows. And I'm going to do another 1/4 inch stitch across the top right there. All right, so this is the back side of the piece we were just working with. We have our 2 seams that we've put in so far. And to reduce bulk, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come in with my scissors, or you could use your rotary cutter. And I'm going to trim that seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. Now what I want to do is I want to press this little seam allowance in one direction. So it doesn't really matter which direction, I'm just going to make sure I am staying consistent with it. I'm going to go ahead and press this seam line up towards this direction. So I'm going to press it with my iron so that this entire seam is going flat like this. I usually do this, but just by using my fingers to sort of roll and feel the seam until I feel it kind of bubble forward in the direction that I want it to go. Again, I'm going to repeat going the same direction for my second seam line. Next, what I'm going to do is I am going to do the exact same process, but now I'm going to do it by column. So I'm going to start by folding over column 1 to column 2, right sides facing, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance on that seam line right there, on that natural crease that is forming. Because I like to make sure everything runs through my sewing machine sort of forwards. So if the presser foot is coming through this way, I like it so that it's not running against this seam right here. So I'm actually probably going to start on this side as my first column, and I'm going to start up here so that I have smooth sailing over these bumps right here. I am making sure to backstitch at each end. All right, so we have one column done, and just like before, I'm going to sort of keep this one out of the way while I fold down this one and keep moving my way across. All right, we've got it all sewn up on all of our columns. I'm just gonna do what we did before, take my scissors and trim all of my 1/4 inch seam allowances down to 1/8 inch. You could also use your rotary cutter and a ruler for this step if that's easier or faster for you. All right, it's starting to look really good. Now I just need to press these seams to one direction again. So I'm probably going to press all of mine in one direction, let's say all going this way. We've got our sewn together square and it's looking just the way I want it to. Here's what the back looks like. All of my seams are sort of pressed in one direction. Now you can possibly tell in the video that some of these edges didn't end up being super square in our final product. So what I want to do is come back to my cutting mat and just square everything up as best I can. That just means making sure that I have right angles at each corner. Trying not to cut off so much though that the size of my quilty patch by a significant amount. Just getting really clean trimmed edges. All right, I think that's pretty good. It's probably not perfect, but nothing in sewing ever is. Now I just need to repeat all these steps on my second knee patch. All right, we've got our 2 quilty knee patches all ready to go. A couple options you could do here. You could leave it just as is, and I'll show you how to hem it in just a second. But another option is to add some little top stitching really, really close to each of your seam lines, running down and just running over your tiny seam edge that's pushed under back there. So you could do some top stitching in an accent or matching thread if you'd like. At this stage right here. You could also layer this on top of whatever it's going to go on. So if I'm doing these as knee patches on pants, I could layer it on top of my pants fabric and actually do the top stitching on, like through both this fabric and onto the pants. I don't tend to do top stitching on mine. I find that it lays really flat by itself, even through multiple washes. So I don't tend to take the extra time to do that because this works out perfectly well for me. So our very last step, whether you do top stitching or not, is to go ahead and prepare this for however you're going to apply it onto your regular garment. So I'm going to have this layered on top of my, like I said, a pair of pants, and these side seams are actually going to be nested into the side seams of the pants, but the top and bottom seams are not. They're going to be just out and about on the front of the pants. So what I'm going to do is just flip it over and I'm going to fold under towards the wrong side my 2 long edges. Now this is just, again, for the project I'm doing. Prepare it in whatever way would make sense for yours, but I'm folding mine under a 1/4 inch just because that will keep all of our squares as square as possible. Since we did 1/4 inch seam allowance, folding it under 1/4 inch is going to help us make these top level squares as square and not rectangular as possible. If I had done a 1/2 inch turn, this would have made more of an oblong rectangle rather than a square. So I'm going to fold my second edge under. And now I would consider this to be ready to go and add on to my pair of pants. I would just lay this right on top of the pant fabric piece and stitch right along here at probably 1/8 of an inch to secure the top and bottom edges down. All right, hope you found that to be as satisfying to sew as I did. I love how clean and crisp the edges turn out, and I'm really excited. I've actually never done it in these colors before, so I'm looking forward to attaching mine to a pair of pants in the near future. And just so you can see a different colorway I've done, here are the knee patches that I usually do on my swallowtail pants. It's much more of a warm, neutral palette that I really like. Of course, I bring these fun tutorials to you for free through YouTube, but if you'd like to support me and what I create, head on over to charliedarwintextiles.com, shop my fabric. You can also find my sewing patterns that I'm releasing on there. The swallowtail pants pattern with the patchwork knees is going to be available next week. So exciting! And of course, if you'd like a Charlie Darwin original, I'd be happy to sew these pants for you in your custom measurements. The link to that physical product is in the description below. And of course, it's always free to like this video. That helps me a lot. And go ahead and subscribe. That way you'll find out about all of my new tutorials and patterns that are coming out very, very soon. All right, it's been real. Enjoy your quilty patchwork on whatever garment you do next, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.